It started like a celebration that was supposed to last all summer, but in the blink of an eye, it turned into heartbreak. Sophie Cunningham and Lexie, two of Caitlin Clark's closest allies, stepped forward with an announcement that silenced the basketball world. Clark, the generational talent, the face of the Indiana Fever, was pulling out of the 2025 WNBA All-Star Weekend. And not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. What began as a season of triumph was now clouded by questions, uncertainty, and a gut punch to the very heart of Indianapolis. The timing made it even more devastating. Just days before, Clark had stood on one of the biggest stages in sports, accepting the WNBA Player of the Year award. She had been the captain of the All-Star Game, the clear favorite in the three-point contest, the one player the entire city couldn't wait to see. And then, nothing. No shooting showcase. No game day heroics. Just an empty spot on a roster, and a wave of disbelief that swept across the league. Fans weren't just shocked, they were grieving. For Cunningham and Hull, the announcement wasn't just about the game, it was personal. These three had built something rare in professional sports, a genuine, unshakable friendship that carried them through the grind of the season. And now, they were watching one of their own forced to step aside at the very peak of her momentum. The silence from the court was deafening, but the emotion behind the scenes was explosive. In that moment, the Fever weren't just missing their star, they were missing the heartbeat of their team. The story didn't end with Clark's announcement. It only deepened. Sophie Cunningham's voice carried the weight of someone trying to keep her teammates' spirit intact while holding back her own frustration. Lexie, normally reserved, showed a side of vulnerability that fans rarely saw, openly sharing her emotions about Clark's absence. The air in Indiana wasn't just tense, it was electric with uncertainty. And yet, there was a sense that this was only the beginning of a much larger story. Because when you strip away the banners, the trophies, and the spotlight, what you're left with is a core question that haunts every great athlete. What happens when your body says stop, but your heart still screams go? That was the reality Caitlin Clark was facing. And for the Fever, it wasn't just about one game or one weekend. It was about protecting a legacy that was still being written. The stakes had never been higher. Indianapolis had been ready for a show, and Caitlin Clark was the star they'd built the entire weekend around. The city had sold out every seat, booked every hotel, plastered her face across every billboard. The three-point contest? She was the one to beat. The All-Star Game? She was the captain. It was supposed to be a coronation, the moment where the rest of the basketball world bowed to a new queen. Instead, it became a gut-wrenching reminder of how fast dreams can shift. It began like any other high-stakes Fever game. Fast-paced, tense, the crowd roaring with every pass. Caitlin Clark was in her rhythm, darting across the court, eyes locked on the basket like she'd done 1,000 times before. And then something shifted. It was subtle at first, almost invisible unless you were watching her every move. A slight hitch in her stride, a grimace she tried to hide, a moment where her hand brushed against her side just a little too long. On the broadcast, commentators kept talking, oblivious to the brewing storm. But courtside, fans began exchanging looks. It wasn't fatigue. This was something else. Each possession seemed to chip away at her energy. And between plays, she wasn't celebrating or calling for the ball with her usual fire. She was conserving, holding back. For someone as competitive as Clark, that alone was alarming. Midway through the quarter, the truth could no longer be masked. Clark winced openly, her face twisting in pain as she pushed through a drive. The crowd, once electric, grew restless, sensing a crack in performance they had come to expect. She finished the possession, but it was clear she was no longer playing the game. She was surviving it. The timeout whistle blew, and that's when it happened. Clark didn't jog to the bench. She limped. Teammates reached out instinctively, helping her take those few steps to the sideline. By the time she sat down, she was clutching her side, her knuckles white against her jersey. The trainer leaned in, whispering, while Sophie Cunningham kept one hand on Clark's shoulder, her jaw tight, eyes scanning the court like she was ready to take on anyone who would cause this. The arena, so loud just moments earlier, felt strangely muted. You could hear the squeak of sneakers, the distant hum of the PA system, but not much else. Even the announcers seemed to falter, their voices dipping into uncertainty. Whatever was wrong with Caitlin Clark, when the halftime buzzer sounded, the Fever headed to the locker room in a tight, protective circle around their star. Reporters craned their necks, hoping for a glimpse, but the message was clear. This was private. And inside those doors, the atmosphere was nothing like the usual mid-game adjustments. This wasn't about tactics anymore. This was about Caitlin. Clark sat on the trainer's table, her jersey untucked, sweat dripping down her face. The medical staff spoke in low tones, running through tests, stretching her leg, watching her reaction. Every flinch told the story. This wasn't something she could shake off in a few minutes. Sophie leaned against a wall, arms crossed, her protective instincts on full display. Lexy Ho sat nearby, untie her shoes, stealing glances at Caitlin like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. The trainer finally spoke the words no one wanted to hear. Aggravated groin injury, manageable if treated right, but dangerous if pushed. The All-Star Weekend was just days away, and suddenly, it wasn't a question of how well will Caitlin perform, but will Caitlin even step on the court at all? The answer, though unspoken in that moment, was already forming in Clark's mind. The team's PR staff wanted to wait before going public. Give it a day, they said. See how it feels in the morning. But Clark knew her body. She knew the risks. Every athlete talks about playing through pain, but there's a line, and she could feel herself dangerously close to crossing it. Sophie caught her eye and shook her head as if to say, "Don't even think about it." Lexy didn't speak, but her gaze was filled with the kind of understanding only teammates share. When Clark finally made the call, it wasn't with fanfare or drawn-out explanation, just a quiet statement. She was withdrawing from All-Star Weekend. No three-point contest. No All-Star game. No appearance in front of her home crowd under the bright arena lights. The decision was hers, but it was one she carried like a weight. For an athlete who had built her identity on showing up for the biggest moments, sitting this one out felt like a loss she couldn't measure. And yet, even in her disappointment, Clark made a promise to be there in spirit. She'd attend the festivities, cheer from the sidelines, and make sure her teammates knew she was still with them, even if she couldn't share the court. It was a small victory in a moment that felt like defeat. But for Sophie and Lexy, it was proof of something they already knew. Caitlin Clark wasn't just a player. She was a leader who understood the long game. The moment the announcement hit social media, the reactions came in waves. Fans flooded her posts with messages of love, heartbreak, and support. Media outlets scrambled to rewrite their all-star coverage. And inside the Fever circle, there was a quiet rallying. This wasn't going to be the Caitlin Clark show anymore. It was going to be the Indiana Fever proving they could rise as a unit. That meant new responsibilities, and for Lexy Ho, it meant stepping directly into the spotlight. Her name was called to replace Clark in the three-point contest, a bittersweet honor. On paper, it was an easy choice. Ho's shooting percentage was among the best in the league. Her form as reliable as clockwork. But the public didn't know that Lexy was still processing her own loss, one that had nothing to do with basketball. Maggie, the dog who had been by her side through championships, losses, and life's quiet moments, was gone. 14 years of loyalty, love, and companionship. Gone in a week when the Fever could least afford another emotional hit. Ho kept playing, kept practicing, but anyone who knew her well could see it. Her smile was a little smaller, her eyes a little dimmer. She posted the news quietly, without the fanfare that often comes with public announcements. Just a few photos and a short caption. The response was overwhelming, but it was the replies from Sophie and Caitlin that mattered most. Sophie's words carried the weight of shared grief. Caitlin's were short, but filled with the kind of love that transcends the game. These weren't teammates offering polite condolences. These were friends. For a league that often focuses on stats, standings, and rivalries, the Fever were showing something different. They were showing what it means to carry each other through the kind of moments that don't show up on a scoreboard, and that, more than any All-Star highlight, was a story worth telling. And that's where Sophie Cunningham's role became impossible to ignore. Known for her grit and defensive fire, Sophie had already earned a reputation as a player who would stand up for her teammates no matter the cost. Earlier in the season, when Clark took a brutal hit, Sophie didn't wait for the refs. She stepped in herself. It earned her a fine, but also earned her the eternal respect of Fever fans. That protective instinct wasn't a one-time thing. Sophie was just as present for Lexy during her loss, checking in, showing up, making sure her teammate didn't feel the weight alone. In the quiet moments that never made the broadcast, Sophie was the glue. She became the emotional anchor, someone who understood that wins come and go, but loyalty lasts forever. The fans saw it. They gave the trio a name, Tres Leches, a playful nod to dessert, but one that perfectly captured their chemistry. 3 distinct flavors blending into something unforgettable. Clark, the star. Cunningham, the protector. Ho, the warrior. Together, they became more than a team. They became a story. That story wasn't built overnight. Cunningham arrived in Indiana hungry for a challenge after years in Phoenix. Ho brought the quiet precision she had honed at Stanford. And when Clark entered the league, the 3 found themselves bound not by circumstance, but by choice. They decided, consciously or not, to protect each other. Through the grind of practices, road trips, and the unglamorous reality of professional sports, they built something rare. They didn't just share a jersey. They shared a mission to play hard, to play for each other, to never let the other stand alone. So when Clark had to sit out, it didn't fracture them, it solidified them. Roles shifted, but trust stayed. The Fever didn't crumble without their superstar. They adapted, they grew, and they kept pushing forward. What began as a devastating setback might end up becoming the defining moment of their season. Because sometimes the real victories aren't on the scoreboard. They're in the bonds you build, the people you protect, and the moments when the game stops but the love doesn't. And for Clark, Cunningham, and Ho, that's the legacy they're writing right now. And yet, even as the Fever pressed forward, there was a sense that this story wasn't finished. Because while fans saw the unity on the court and the camaraderie in interviews, they didn't see the late-night conversations, the quiet moments after practice, or the unspoken agreements that bonded this team. Sophie, Caitlin, and Lexy weren't just surviving the storm. They were planning how to come out of it stronger than ever. This wasn't damage control. This was strategy born from loyalty. Caitlin Clark, sidelined but not silenced, became an emotional conductor from the bench. She wasn't pacing nervously or lost in her own thoughts. She was locked in, studying plays, calling out tips, rallying the team like a coach in sneakers. Every time a Fever player hit a big shot, Clark was the first to leap to her feet, hands in the air, smile breaking through the frustration. It was a reminder to fans that her presence was still a weapon, even if she wasn't taking the shots herself. For Sophie Cunningham, this was her chance to redefine leadership in real time. She'd always been known for her fire and grit, but now, without Clark's offense to lean on, she was becoming the soul of the Fever's defense. She was barking out rotations, clapping in teammates' faces, diving for loose balls as if the scoreboard didn't matter. Every possession was a statement. We fight for each other. That's what Indiana basketball is about. Lexy Ho's transformation was just as powerful, though it came in quieter ways. With her heart still aching from Maggie's loss, she poured herself into her shooting. Every three-pointer she sank was met with an eruption from the Fever bench and a subtle glance upward, like a silent tribute to companions she'd lost. Fans began to notice, and suddenly, Ho's story wasn't just about filling Clark's spot. It was about resilience, the kind that inspires even in the darkest weeks. The media tried to spin it as a Cinderella survival story, but those inside the Fever knew better. This wasn't luck. It was a result of a culture they had been building long before the cameras started rolling. Practices had always been laced with encouragement. Road trips were filled with laughter that made the grind bearable. And now, when the league expected them to falter, they were showing the world that their greatest strength wasn't a single player. It was their connection. Behind closed doors, the trio's bond deepened. Sophie would send Lexy late-night memes to make her laugh. Caitlin would FaceTime in from her apartment during rehab sessions, hyping up the shooters and offering pointers. Lexy, in turn, would bring small gifts to lighten the mood, a bag of candy for Sophie, a handwritten note for Caitlin. It was these tiny, human gestures that kept the weight of the season from crushing them. And slowly, the narrative began to shift. What started as, how will they survive without Caitlin Clark, was turning into, look at what the Fever are becoming. Wins began stacking up. Confidence grew. The league, once watching for a collapse, was now keeping an eye on a team that seemed to have unlocked a different gear. Indiana was no longer just a rising squad. They were becoming a blueprint for team chemistry. But with every step forward came the looming question, when would Caitlin return? The rehab process was meticulous, filled with small victories and frustrating plateaus. Clark attacked it with the same determination she brought to every game, but she was also patient, knowing this wasn't a sprint. The Fever didn't push her because they knew when she came back, It needed to be for good. Fans began counting the days, circling potential return dates on their calendars. The anticipation wasn't just about seeing Clark hit another deep three. It was about the moment Trace Letches would reunite on the floor. Sophie, Lexy, and Caitlin had become symbols of heart over hype, loyalty over ego. Their return to full strength wasn't just going to be another game. It was going to be a statement to the entire WNBA. And when that day came, when the arena lights dimmed and the crowd roared as Caitlin Clark jogged back on the court with Sophie on one side and Lexy on the other, it wouldn't just be a comeback. It would be a victory lap for everything they had endured. The scoreboard might say it was the start of another game, but for Indiana, it would feel like the closing chapter to one of the most powerful stories the league had ever seen.